Now we will look at the categories of conflict of interest. There are three. The first is clear or actual conflicts. These are obvious. An example would be a construction inspector who doesn't object to a contractor placing a lower strength concrete on a job being inspected in exchange for the contractor delivering a few meters of concrete to the inspector's home for a retaining wall project. The second category is potential or latent conflicts. In this case, there may be no immediate benefit, and any benefit in the future may only be triggered by another future event, but if that event occurs, there is a clear conflict. An example is a consulting firm donating a large sum of money to a candidate's campaign to become mayor. If elected, the mayor may favor that consultant when awarding city projects. The final category is perceived conflict. This is really more of a misunderstanding, where no conflict may actually exist, but circumstances indicate to observers that there may be a conflict. An example could be where a professional engineer or geoscientist requires an administrative assistant and asks that the human resources department hire one. If by coincidence the new administrative assistant has the same last name as the professional, colleagues may believe that the assistant is a relative. To avoid this perceived conflict of interest, it is usually sufficient to simply explain publicly that there are no family relationships. Next, we'll take a brief look at conflict of interest in management. Managers must set an example by avoiding conflicts of interest themselves and also by establishing clear policies for employees. One key policy area relates to the acceptance of unsolicited gifts. Some companies have a strict policy that employees cannot accept any gift or benefit from a client, supplier, or colleague. This policy has the advantage that it is simple, easily understood, and easily applied. Other companies set a limit for the value of a gift, such as $20, but this can be subjective if the value of the gift is unknown. Accepting even a small gift may be construed as a conflict of interest. The company policy should require that when a conflict of interest situation arises, it be disclosed to the necessary parties. The parties may or may not deem the conflict situation acceptable. Failure on the part of a professional to disclose a serious conflict is considered unprofessional conduct. Conflict of interest in consulting. A conflict of interest arises when a professional has any interest that interferes with the services owed to a client. Here are a couple examples of this category. A consultant recommends a client purchase goods or services from another company that pays a secret commission to the consultant or from a company in which the consultant is a part owner. Another, a consultant suggests a technical change that will reduce the consultant's workload. Unless there is a corresponding reduction in fee, the consultant has a conflict of interest. When a conflict or potential conflict of interest arises, the consultant must disclose it to the client, who can assess the severity of the conflict. This can be the case with some real estate transactions where the same realtor represents both the buyer and the seller. If the client agrees that conflict is insignificant, then the work proceeds, but the client is now making a fully informed choice. The rule of thumb is, if there is a hint that there may be a conflict, disclose it to the appropriate parties, your client, your supervisor, or your employer. So, how can you avoid conflicts of interest? The first step in avoiding a conflict of interest is recognizing that an actual, apparent, or potential for conflict exists. We will speak briefly about the trust test that will help you recognize a conflict situation. Beyond that, we may need to remove ourselves completely from a possible conflict situation or seek independent advice. You need to determine if the situation you are in is likely to interfere with or appear to interfere with the independent judgment you are supposed to show as a professional in performing your official duties. A good test is the trust test. Ask yourself, would my employers, clients, professional colleagues, or members of the public in general, trust my judgment if they knew I was in this situation. Trust is at the heart of the issue. Conflicts of interest involve the abuse, actual or potential, of the trust people have in professionals, not just the individuals, but the professions as a whole. A good way of dealing with the conflict is to reveal your private interest in the matter to relevant parties. If we let others know what might be influencing our judgment, they can be on guard and not be caught unaware. But sometimes it isn't enough to know that there is a particular private interest influencing a professional's judgment. The client, employer, or others expect that the professional will stay out of such situations. So the second way to avoid conflicts of interest is to absent yourself from the decision-making or advice-giving if you have a private interest. In the self-dealing example, we spoke about using your government position to secure contracting for a consulting firm you own. The conscientious professional will not become involved in a situation where the person is both bidding on a government contract and deciding as a public servant who is awarded the contract. The professional will either step aside and completely absent themselves from determining who gets the contract, or refrain from bidding on such a contract in the first place, which is probably the wisest course of action. It takes skill and good judgment to recognize that you're in a conflict of interest situation. This is because private and personal interests can cloud a person's objectivity. In fact, it can be much easier to recognize when someone else is in conflict than when you are. Therefore, it can be helpful to consult with a trusted colleague or a friend when you are in doubt.